there's definitely a shadow that's been cast by the dictatorship. And you're right. He stifled Portuguese culture. We didn't stifle it. He actually celebrated Portuguese culture. His whole thing, Salazar's whole thing was the three Fs. It was Fatima, football, and Fado. And he wanted ultra Portugal. He loved Portugal. He just loved Portugal. And he wanted to celebrate it and wanted to maintain it. But he wanted to maintain it by avoiding any form of modernity. There's this quite famous anecdote. I wonder if it's true, but there's a famous anecdote where supposedly his minister had come to him and he was organizing water into a very rundown, poor Alentasian village. And the minister had said, right, we need to plug water, we need to plug this into the water supply, blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, we can't do that because if we do that, the woman won't be able to collect at the well anymore and gossip. He had such an old-fashioned view. One, he had an old-fashioned view, but two, he had this view that you had to keep everything as is. You could not change anything.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing about Salazar is that in his early days, he was celebrated. He brought order to chaos when there was so much chaos after the king was assassinated. And then he very carefully and a very fine line kept Portugal out of the war, and he did this extremely successfully. He had so much pressure on both sides from the Axis and the Allies. And of course, as we were talking about before, he almost got invaded during that period. But he managed to keep Portugal out of the war. And so post World War II, it's like, my gosh, this guy has, saved us. One of the few countries in the world that didn't have this extraordinary violence put on top of it. But he then stayed on. He then stayed on for another 26 years. And he kind of didn't leave. He fell over, knocked his head, and then ended up dying. He didn't even, it wasn't like he was overthrown. His government was overthrown 3 years later. But that 26 years in which he stayed on is when the rot set in, when people couldn't, women weren't allowed to leave the country without their husband's permission. Everything was so controlled and stifled. And, he left a country in 1974, when the revolution occurred, he left a country with one of the highest infant mortality rates, one of the lowest literacy rates. It's kind of a deindustrialized nation, with corruption that was, rampant. And so, that was kind of his legacy. Whereas it didn't have to be that way, but that turned into his legacy. And I don't know he comes from a town called Santa Pombadao. I'm not saying that right. Santa Pombadao. It's this tiny village just north, west of Coimbra.
Okay.
And I visited, and outside this tiny village is even a much smaller cemetery, and it's where he's buried. And it's remarkable how unremarkable his grave is. His grave is a concrete slab next to other concrete slabs, and some concrete slabs are bigger. And there's an old sepia photo of him in a suit on it, but otherwise there's nothing. And so for someone to rule, he was the longest dictator in 20th century history. For someone to rule that long, and to have no memorial, to have his gravesite completely unremarkable, is illustrative of how people think of him.
Yeah.
And what his lasting legacy is not a positive one.